You buy a house in Australia's capital city. You pay 1.2 million Australian dollars. You sign the contract, you get the keys, you move in. And you do not own the land underneath your home. I know that sounds insane. It's not. Every single residential property in the Australian Capital Territory is held under a Crown lease, the government's land, not freehold title. That is not a loophole. That is the default legal structure of the entire territory. And Canberra is just the beginning. Here is what the standard real estate search does not tell you. You browse listings on Domain or realestate.com.au. You see the price, the bedrooms, the garage. What you do not see, unless you read the title documents very carefully, is the tenure type sitting beneath every transaction. The ACT Government Planning Directorate confirms it on their own Crown Leases page. ABC News Curious Canberra has reported it directly, and it is not an isolated quirk. Across Commonwealth Australia, 5 distinct places operate under 5 different legal frameworks that all lead to the same practical outcome. Paying for a property does not deliver what most buyers assume they are buying. This is not about one unusual case. This is a pattern built into the architecture of Australian land law. Start with the number, because the number is the whole story. Median house prices in inner Canberra's suburbs commonly exceed $1 million. In the suburb of Forest, leafy streets, federal government proximity, the kind of address that signals arrival, you are looking at figures well north of that. And the person writing that cheque, signing that contract, moving into that home, does not own the land it sits on. Not in the freehold sense, not in the way a buyer in Sydney's inner west or Melbourne's inner north owns their land. What they own is a Crown lease, typically 99 years, held over land that belongs to the Commonwealth. The mechanism goes back to 1911, when the Federal Capital Territory was established. The founding legal architecture made a deliberate choice. No private freehold in the national capital. All land would be held by the Commonwealth and granted to occupants only under lease. The logic was partly philosophical, the idea that the nation's capital should not be subject to private land speculation, and partly practical, in that the Commonwealth needed to retain long-term control over the territory's development. When the ACT gained self-government in 1989, the leasehold system was carried forward intact. It did not dissolve with self-government. It became the ACT's inheritance. Here is what that means on the ground in 2026. A buyer in Belconnen, one of Canberra's outer suburbs, median prices well below the inner ring, is subject to the same legal framework as the buyer in Forest, paying more than twice as much. The Crown lease is not a tiered system based on property value. It is the framework. All of it. The $450,000 unit and the $1.5 million standalone home are both held under Crown lease terms. The ACT Government Planning Directorate's Crown Leases page makes this explicit. The lease is what is being transferred when a property changes hands, not a freehold title. Now, in daily practice, the distinction is largely invisible. Canberra is not a town of anxious residents worried about the state of their land tenure. Crown leases in the ACT are renewable, transferable, and inheritable. You can borrow against a leasehold property. You can renovate it, sell it, leave it to your children. The residential experience is, for most people, functionally indistinguishable from freehold ownership. Banks lend on leasehold properties in the ACT without significant hesitation. The market treats them as assets. But here is where the legal distinction actually bites. The lease conditions can include covenants about how the land must be used. If you want to subdivide, extend the use, or change the purpose of the lot, the Crown lease conditions govern whether that is permitted, not simply council planning rules. The Crown, as the underlying landowner, retains a layer of authority over the use of the land that does not exist in a freehold system, and in the event, admittedly unlikely but legally real, that the Crown lease were not renewed or were terminated for breach of conditions, the position of the occupant is not the same as that of a freehold owner, who can never have their underlying title extinguished in that way. Walk the streets of Canberra and none of this is visible. The houses look like houses anywhere. Griffin-designed boulevards, Griffith-influenced garden suburbs, new subdivisions in Molonglo and Gungahlin that look like any other modern Australian residential development. The landscape is deliberate. The national capital was planned, laid out, designed. Walter Burley Griffin's competition-winning plan from 1912 shaped the bones of what became Canberra's geometry. The mountains to the south, the lake at the centre, the parliamentary triangle. It is a city that was designed to project stability and permanence, and yet the legal structure beneath it is something that most buyers, even well-informed buyers using experienced conveyancers, do not fully interrogate before they sign. The ACT government publishes the Crown lease system openly. It is not secret. But the gap between what is legally true and what buyers functionally understand is persistent. People move to Canberra for public service roles, for proximity to federal institutions, for the schools and the infrastructure and the livability rankings. The land tenure question is rarely the first thing a buyer asks about, and it is rarely the first thing an agent volunteers. The honest, the straightforward calibration here is this. The Canberra Crown lease system has not caused mass legal dysfunction. Canberra's property market is one of the most expensive in the country. The leasehold framework has not suppressed prices. But what it does do, structurally, is establish a clear precedent that in at least one major Australian jurisdiction, the standard assumption about what you buy when you buy a home is factually wrong. And that is before we get to places where the legal frameworks are less routine, less well-funded, and considerably less comfortable. That last point matters. Because Canberra is the well-resourced version of this problem, the national capital, full of lawyers, with a government that publishes its own tenure rules clearly. The next cases on this list operate with less infrastructure around the buyer, less clarity in the documents, and considerably more at stake if the legal layers are misread. What you've just seen is the most expensive version of this problem, a city where buyers spend over $1 million Australian and the land beneath the house belongs to the Crown. But the next place flips the equation. Here, the legal framework does not sit beneath a high-value suburban market, it sits beneath a working mine. And the person occupying the land has not just signed a Crown lease, they've staked a mineral claim. A town of roughly 2,000 people where mining law, Crown land conditions, and residential occupation all press down on the same patch of dirt at once. How does someone actually live under that? There is a town in far northwest New South Wales, 9 hours by road from Sydney, deep in flat scrubland country where the heat is real and the dust is constant, where some people live on land they do not own in any freehold sense, not because of a philosophical decision made at Federation, but because the ground under their home is legally a mine site. Lightning Ridge, population around 2079, the opal capital of the world. And the legal architecture underneath its residential occupation is unlike anything in mainstream Australian property law. The visual first. Lightning Ridge sits in open mulga country at the edge of the outback. Red earth, scattered eucalyptus, water tanks and corrugated iron on every block. The town looks improvised, because in large part it was. People came for opal, they stayed for opal, and the structures they built, the yards they fenced, the sheds and dugouts and unconventional dwellings that populate the edges of the town reflect a community that grew around a resource rather than around a council plan. Lightning Ridge has always operated at the frontier of what residential occupation looks like. The mechanism is this. Lightning Ridge sits inside what New South Wales mining legislation designates as a mineral claims district. Within that district, the New South Wales Resources Regulator governs mineral claims, the legal right to mine for opal in a defined area. Alongside the mineral claims framework, the New South Wales Crown Lands portal documents what are known as camps on claim leases, 20-year residential leases tied to mineral claim activity. The lease allows occupation. You can build, live, maintain a residence, but the tenure is a lease, not freehold. The Crown holds the land, the occupant holds a leasehold right, tied in the case of camps on claim leases to the existence and maintenance of the underlying mineral claim. What that looks like in practice is something that deserves a full description. A person comes to Lightning Ridge in the 1980s. They stake a claim. They build a shed on it, then a more substantial structure. They dig. They find opal, or they don't. Over time, the dwelling becomes their home. They maintain the claim. They pay the fees. They meet the conditions. 40 years pass. They are still, in the language of the New South Wales Crown Lands documents, a lessee, not an owner. The land beneath their home is still held by the Crown, still subject to the conditions of the lease framework, still legally distinct from the freehold blocks in the residential portion of town where ordinary conveyancing applies. Wittenoom Crown Lands documents the Camps on Claim lease as a 20-year residential lease, with conversion to perpetuity intended under specified conditions. Note the word intended. The pathway to perpetuity exists, it is documented, but the language throughout is lease language, not freehold language, and the distinction between a perpetual lease and freehold title is not merely semantic, it carries legal weight in the event of challenge, change of law, or dispute about land use. The calibration here matters, and it matters precisely. Not every address in Lightning Ridge is a mineral claim or a Camps on Claim lease. The town has a conventional residential grid with freehold lots. People live in Lightning Ridge on ordinary title. The case here is not a blanket claim that nobody in Lightning Ridge owns land. The case is that a substantial portion of the town's occupation, including some of its most characteristic dwellings, operates under the mineral claims and Crown leasehold framework, and that a buyer encountering Lightning Ridge property without understanding that framework is operating with an incomplete picture. The drawbacks are real and worth naming. Lightning Ridge is genuinely remote. The nearest major hospital with full surgical capability is in Dubbo, more than 3 hours south. Summer temperatures regularly push past 40 degrees Celsius. Water is a constant practical issue. The local economy depends heavily on the opal trade, which is unpredictable, and the legal complexity of the land tenure framework means that any buyer needs specialist advice, not a standard suburban conveyancer, but someone who understands mining tenements, Western lands leases, and the New South Wales Resources Regulator framework simultaneously. Ask any long-term Lightning Ridge resident about this, and most of them will tell you the same thing. The system works if you understand it, and it breaks down fast if you don't. Locals who have lived on the field for decades have navigated the lease conditions, the claim renewals, the bureaucratic requirements of both the New South Wales Resources Regulator and New South Wales Crown Lands. They know what they hold and what they don't. The risk is the newcomer. The person who sees an affordable property listing, imagines a rural lifestyle, and does not read the tenure type before they commit. Lightning Ridge has a particular quality that makes the legal complexity easy to overlook. The town has genuine character. The opal market, the public baths, the local festivals, the sense of a community that built itself on its own terms. These things are real. People love living there, and they say so loudly. But liking where you live and understanding what you legally hold over the dirt beneath your house are two separate questions. Lightning Ridge is the place where those two questions diverge most visibly from anywhere else on this list, except for the next entry, where the legal complexity doesn't come from mining law alone. It comes from Commonwealth legislation. 2 places down. In both of them, the legal framework beneath the property is something the average buyer encounters only after committing. But neither of those places reach the level of federal government involvement in the land question. The next entry has a population of 103 people. It has dugout homes built into hillsides to survive 40-degree heat. And in 2026, the Federal Attorney General made a native title determination for the main field under Section 26C of the Native Title Act, a federal determination, for a town of 103 people. That tells you exactly what kind of land this is. Imagine a town that was once home to 4,500 people. Imagine that those people came because the ground beneath their feet contained something valuable, stayed long enough to build a community, and then mostly left when the rush faded. Imagine that what remained, a population that now sits around 103 people at the most recent count, lives in homes carved directly into the hillside to escape heat that regularly exceeds 40 degrees Celsius. Dugout homes, literally underground. And in 2026, the Federal Attorney General issued a determination under Section 26C of the Native Title Act that touched the same ground those dugouts are built into. That is White Cliffs, in far western New South Wales, and it is one of the most legally layered pieces of occupied land in the country. The history is not recent. The opal rush at White Cliffs began in the late 1880s. At the peak, around 4,500 people were working the field, a genuine 19th century boomtown in the middle of a semi-arid landscape 5 hours west of Broken Hill. The opal was extraordinary, Some of the finest stones ever found in Australia came out of White Cliffs in those years. Then the field thinned, the rush moved on, eventually to Lightning Ridge, and the population collapsed. By the mid-20th century, White Cliffs had become one of those places that existed on the map, but barely in the national consciousness. What stayed was the legal complexity, because the White Cliffs Mineral Claims District never went away. The town sits inside a regulatory zone governed by the South Wales Resources Regulator, the same body that oversees Lightning Ridge's opal industry. But White Cliffs adds a layer that Lightning Ridge's entry did not require: a federal native title determination. In 2026, NSW's Resources confirmed that the Commonwealth Attorney General had made a Section 26C determination under the Native Title Act for the main field in the White Cliffs Mineral Claims District. The purpose of that determination was to designate the main field as an approved opal and gem mining area, allowing mineral claims to recommence subject to legal requirements. Slow down on that for a moment. A federal determination, not a state council vote, not a planning amendment, a determination by the Commonwealth Attorney General under the Native Title Act, the same legislation that governs Indigenous land rights across the country. The reason such a determination was needed is that native title, the recognition of Indigenous Australians' rights and interests in land under their traditional laws and customs, applies to the area. The process of allowing opal mining to recommence required a federal legal instrument to navigate the intersection of mining law and native title. That is the legal environment that surrounds whatever surface title exists in White Cliffs. Picture what that means for someone looking at a dugout. The structure is genuinely compelling. Homes built into the soft white clay of the hillside, cool in summer relative to the outside, immune to the cyclical flooding that affects surface structures, visually unlike anything else in Australian residential architecture. People live in these things. They have electricity, furniture, the practical features of a normal home. From the inside, a well-maintained White Cliffs dugout is comfortable, quirky, and genuinely distinct. From a legal framework perspective, the person living in it is occupying a piece of ground that sits inside a mineral claims district, within the scope of a federal native title determination, in a region administered by the New South Wales Resources Regulator. The calibration again must be precise. Not every White Cliffs address is a mineral claim or a dugout on Crown land. Some surface title exists in the town. Some conventional property transactions have occurred. The case here is not that White Cliffs is entirely non-freehold. The case is that the legal environment surrounding whatever title does exist in White Cliffs is shaped by opal law, mining law, and federal native title frameworks before ordinary property law concepts even enter the picture. A buyer using a standard residential conveyancer, expecting a standard property transaction, is walking into a legal context that the standard residential process is not designed to handle. The physical drawbacks are severe enough to mention independently of the legal ones. White Cliffs is approximately 1,000 kilometres west of Sydney. The road from Broken Hill is unsealed in sections. There is no major hospital within several hours' drive. The summer heat is not a minor inconvenience. It is the reason the population built underground. The economy that once supported 4,500 people no longer exists, and the remaining community of roughly 103 people sustains itself through a combination of opal mining, tourism, the dugout homes attract visitors, and the practical self-reliance of remote area living. What the 2026 Native Title Determination signals more broadly is that the ground at White Cliffs is not simply abandoned, administratively quiet land waiting for a real estate agent to price it up. It is land where multiple active legal frameworks, Commonwealth, state, mining, and native title, are in ongoing operation simultaneously. The determination was made because mining was set to recommence. That means the field is active again, at least partially, which means the legal layers are not historical curiosities, they are current operating conditions. Locals who have stayed in White Cliffs through the decades of population decline will tell you that understanding the claim system is just part of living there. It is the water you swim in. But what long-term residents absorb intuitively is exactly what a new buyer, arriving with assumptions formed by a lifetime of suburban property transactions, is most likely to miss. The legal environment at White Cliffs is not hostile. It is complex, in a way that requires specific knowledge to navigate, and the person who acquires a dugout or a claim-based holding without that knowledge has not bought what they think they bought. That pattern of legal complexity being invisible until after the commitment is made runs through every entry on this list. But the next entry is different in kind, not just in degree, because in the next place, the land was never going to be on the market in the first place. There is no moment when the buyer could have done better research and come away with freehold. The land is not structured for that transaction at all. South of Sydney, just over 2 hours by road, there is a stretch of coastline that ranks among the clearest water in New South Wales. Jervis Bay. White sand, turquoise water, dolphins in the shallows. The kind of place that a property developer would spend years trying to unlock. And at the southern end of Jervis Bay, there is a community called Wreck Bay, where the land is not on the market, has never been on the open market, and where the legal framework that governs occupation is not a variation on standard residential property law. It is something structurally different. Wreck Bay is a community in the Jervis Bay Territory, a Commonwealth-administered federal territory that is not part of New South Wales, not part of the ACT, not part of any Australian state, despite sitting between them geographically. The Jervis Bay Territory is a remnant of federal geography. When the ACT was established, Jervis Bay was included as a separate Commonwealth territory to give the Capital Territory ocean access. It is governed federally, not by a state government. That jurisdictional distinction matters enormously for what happens with the land. The land at Wreck Bay is governed by the Aboriginal Land Grant, Jervis Bay Territory Act, passed by the Commonwealth Parliament in 1986. That legislation granted the land to the Wreck Bay Aboriginal community and established the Wreck Bay Aboriginal Community Council as the governing body for the community's land. The council is a Commonwealth-recognised entity. The land it administers is not available for purchase by outside buyers through any standard real estate mechanism. It is not listed on domain. It is not priced by any agency. It is community land, held under federal Aboriginal land legislation, with governance structures that operate entirely outside the state-based property framework that applies to almost every other coastal community in southeastern Australia. Consider the contrast. 100 kilometres up the coast, or across the bay in Vincentia, the real estate market functions as it does anywhere. Listings, offers, conveyancing, freehold transfer. Land has a price, a buyer pays it, title transfers. The market is normal. At Wreck Bay, that transaction does not exist. Not because the community is poor, or because the land is legally encumbered in a way that could be resolved with better advice. Because the land was granted to the community under federal legislation and is administered through a community governance structure that is not a transactional property market. The population at Wreck Bay is around 197 people, a small community living on a piece of the most beautiful coastline in New South Wales, arguably in Australia. From a pure amenity standpoint, the location is extraordinary. National park on 3 sides, direct beach access, the kind of natural environment that attracts millions of visitors to nearby Hymes Beach every year. And the legal framework over that land is, in part, what has preserved its character. The land was never released to the market. The community did not lose the coast. The coast stayed with the community. This entry requires a different kind of framing than the earlier ones. At Canberra, the buyer is disadvantaged by a legal structure they likely do not fully understand. At Lightning Ridge, the minor occupant is navigating a mining law framework that requires specialist knowledge. At White Cliffs, the legal complexity is compounded by federal native title. In each of those cases, the narrative has some element of the buyer being at risk of misunderstanding. At Wreck Bay, there is no buyer. That is the structural point. The land was not placed in a condition where outside buyers could misread the tenure and commit to the wrong thing. It was placed in a condition where outside buyers cannot transact at all. The Wreck Bay Aboriginal Community Council manages the land under the framework established in 1986. The community at Wreck Bay has lived at Jervis Bay for a very long time. The Koori people's connection to the area predates European settlement. The 1986 Act was a recognition, partial as such recognitions are, of a prior relationship with the land. The governance structure that flows from it, the council, the community landholding, The absence of a freehold market is not a bureaucratic accident. It is the deliberate legal expression of a different relationship between people and land than the one that governs the rest of coastal New South Wales. For the purposes of this video's central question, what does paying for a home actually buy you? Wreck Bay answers it by removing the premise. There is no payment structure that delivers freehold in Wreck Bay. That option does not exist in the legislative framework. It was not a policy left open and later closed. It was not a market that was available and then restricted. The Aboriginal Land Grant, Jervis Bay Territory Act, created a structure from the beginning that was not about market transactions. That is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working as designed. But it makes Wreck Bay the clearest single example in southeastern Australia of a place where the standard property law framework does not apply. Not because it has been distorted or complicated, but because it was never installed. The drawbacks here are not economic in the usual sense. The community is not suffering from land tenure complexity in the way that a Lightning Ridge buyer might. The residents of Wreck Bay are not at risk of misreading their tenure. The challenge, if there is one from the community's perspective, is the ongoing work of administering land under federal legislation, with the resources available to a community of 197 people in a federal territory that does not have the administrative infrastructure of a state. But that is a governance challenge, not a property market one. What Wreck Bay establishes in this list is a boundary condition. All the other entries involve buyers or occupants encountering legal complexity they may have underestimated. Wreck Bay establishes that the outer limit of that complexity is a place where the buyer relationship does not exist at all. And then there is one more entry, one where freehold did exist, did function, and was extinguished, not by community governance or mining law or Crown lease conditions, but by Act of Parliament. Everything on this list so far has involved a legal mechanism that shaped or constrained what land ownership means. Crown leasehold in the ACT, mineral claims and Western lands leases in Lightning Ridge, opal law and native title at Whitecliffs, community land governance at Wreck Bay. Each of those mechanisms is, in its own way, a constraint on the freehold concept, a framework that sits beneath or beside conventional ownership and changes what a buyer actually holds. But Wittenoom is not a constraint on ownership. Wittenoom is the termination of it. The town of Wittenoom is in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, set in the Hamersley Range country. Iron red gorges, spinifex, the immense mineral landscape of the northwest. The gorges near Wittenoom are, purely as geography, among the most extraordinary in the country. Wittenoom Gorge itself, the Hancock Gorge, the Karijini National Park that now surrounds what used to be the town site. The landscape is vast and ancient and completely indifferent to human settlement. And the human settlement that was Wittenoom has been erased, not by economics alone, by law. The history is specific and cannot be softened. Blue asbestos, crocidolite, was mined in the Wittenoom Gorge from the 1940s until 1966 by Australian Blue Asbestos, a subsidiary of CSR. At its peak, Wittenoom had a population estimated at around 20,000 people, including miners, their families, and the service workers who supported a functioning town. It had a hospital, schools, a swimming pool, the full infrastructure of a mid-century Australian mining community. It also had asbestos tailings, waste material from the processing of the ore, spread across the town site, used as road gravel, piled in accessible areas, and carried as dust on the wind. When the mine closed in 1966, the contamination did not close with it. The tailings remained, the dust remained. Mesothelioma, the cancer caused by asbestos fibre inhalation, has a latency period of decades, which means that the full weight of Wittenoom's contamination toll did not appear immediately, but accumulated across years and then decades following the mine's closure. The death toll from Wittenoom-related disease is one of the most significant industrial health catastrophes in Australian history. Hundreds of people who lived and worked in Wittenoom have died from asbestos-related disease. The number continues to grow. The state and federal response was progressive. By 2007, Wittenoom was officially degazetted as a town, removed from the official register of Western Australian town sites. Services were withdrawn, the road was removed from official maps, but a small number of residents remained, holding private freehold title to properties in the town site. These were people who, for various reasons, had not accepted the earlier buyout offers the state had extended. They held clean, freehold title, ordinary residential title, the kind of title that in any other context would give the owner the strongest possible claim to remain. And they stayed. In March 2022, the Western Australian Parliament passed the Wittenoom Closure Act. ABC News confirmed the passage of the bill. The Act authorised the state to compulsorily acquire the remaining private properties in Wittenoom and to demolish the buildings. Compulsory acquisition is a power that exists in every Australian jurisdiction. The state can acquire privately held land for public purposes, and the owner is entitled to compensation, but not to refuse. In Wittenoom's case, the public purpose was the elimination of a known contamination hazard incompatible with human habitation. By 2026, the town site has been physically removed from official roadmaps. The last private holdings have been acquired under the Closure Act, and Wittenoom, as a legal and physical entity, no longer exists. Think about what that means in the context of this video. The buyer who purchased property in Wittenoom in the 1950s or 1960s bought in good faith. They paid real money. They held freehold title, the strongest form of land ownership available in Australian property law. Freehold, in the conventional understanding, means the most complete legal interest in land. No Crown lease conditions, no mineral claim framework, no community governance structure. You own it. And it was still not enough. Because the contamination beneath and around the property was not something that changed with the title. The asbestos fibres in the soil and the air did not care who held the deed. And when the state concluded that the level of contamination was incompatible with human survival, the Closure Act extinguished the title. This is the limit case. I want to be clear about the framing here because precision matters. Wittenoom is not presented as a place to buy today. There is nothing to buy. The town does not exist. The framing is specifically this. Wittenoom is the proof in Australian legal history that freehold ownership has a ceiling. That the strongest form of land title available in this country can be overridden by a sufficiently serious public interest, exercised through parliamentary legislation and compulsory acquisition powers. The buyer who thought freehold meant security was right about freehold and wrong about security. Those are not the same thing. The Wittenoom case also raises a question that the other entries on this list do not quite reach. At Canberra, the Crown lease system was disclosed from the beginning. The ACT government publishes it. It is part of the territory's known legal identity. At Lightning Ridge and White Cliffs, specialist advice will surface the mineral claims framework. At Wreck Bay, the community land grant legislation is clear to anyone who looks at the jurisdictional map. But at Wittenoom, the thing that destroyed the value of freehold ownership was not the title document at all. It was what was in the ground. The asbestos tailings were known to the company. They were known to state authorities. The full extent of the health consequences was, for a long time, not communicated to the workers and families living in the town. People who thought they were making a straightforward choice about where to live, in a town with jobs, infrastructure, and ordinary residential land, were making that choice in the absence of information that would have changed it. Wittenoom's gorges are still there. The landscape is still extraordinary. Karijini National Park, which borders what was the town site, receives visitors every year who come for the gorges and the iron red country. But the town that once occupied that ground is gone by Act of Parliament, and the people who once held freehold title to its lots hold nothing there now except, in some cases, the memory of a life they built in a place that the state ultimately concluded could not be allowed to continue. The Wittenoom Closure Act is also the clearest possible demonstration that the legal system itself is the adversarial agent in this story. Not a single institution, not one bank or one developer or one government department acting in bad faith, but the mechanism of law operating as it is designed to operate, for reasons that are legally legitimate, with consequences that are final. The freehold owner in Wittenoom was not defrauded. They were acquired, under law, with compensation, and with no legal avenue to remain. The lesson from Wittenoom is not that freehold ownership is worthless. Across most of Australia, in most circumstances, it is the most robust form of land tenure available. The lesson is that it operates within a legal system that retains, always, the capacity to override it. Compulsory acquisition exists in every Australian state and territory. The threshold for exercising it in Wittenoom's case, irreversible contamination of a town site by one of the most dangerous known carcinogens, was extreme. But the mechanism that allowed it was ordinary. It was the same mechanism that acquires land for highways and railways and public infrastructure, applied to a residential town site, because the contamination made ordinary human habitation legally untenable. That is where this list ends. Not with a place where you can buy cheaply, not with a place where an unusual legal quirk creates an opportunity, with a place where the question of ownership was answered definitively by Parliament, and the answer was, not anymore. 5 different legal mechanisms operating across Commonwealth Australia, and none of them disclosed by a standard property search. The question that remains, and it does remain because this is not just about 5 unusual places, is how many buyers across Australia have signed contracts without knowing which legal framework sits beneath the transaction they just made. Which of these 5 cases changes the way you think about what property ownership actually means in this country? Write it below, the specific one, and why. And if this kind of legal framework breakdown is useful to you, subscribe.